This area of Coburg looks vastly different today. But around this location back in 1886, a tragedy occurred that had ramifications for every member of the family. The Hampton family consisted of Charles and his wife Elizabeth and their 8 children: Charles 27, Annie 25, Frederick 23, Eleanor 21, Mary 19, Arthur 16, Florence and Ethel, who was just 8 years old. Florence had passed away in 1875 at age 5 years. Charles was a warder at the nearby Pentridge prison where he'd worked for 26 years. The family had lived in Louisa Street house for 9 years at the time of the murder. The couple were kind of estranged due to Elizabeth's, as described at the time, aberrations of the mind. Dr. Cook had suggested placing her in an asylum, as had been done with her aunt in Tasmania, but Charles thought she was harmless as she'd never hurt anyone. He would be proven wrong. Elizabeth and her daughters slept in a bedroom together at the front of the house, whilst Charles and the boys had rooms in another part of the house. Ethel also had her own room. On the night of the 26th of January 1886, Elizabeth and the girls asked Ethel to sleep with them in their room. No one believed the little one, as Ethel was known, was in any danger, as she was adored by all members of the family. At around 12:30 a.m, a scream woke the household. Charles and his sons ran to their mother's bedroom, demanding admittance. However, Elizabeth reassured them that all was well and it was just Annie who had fainted earlier that day, fainting again. Thinking all was well, the men returned to their beds. They were not aware of the horrendous scene that had taken place behind the closed door. Elizabeth and her elder daughters had become convinced that their purity was at risk and that they should die rather than be compelled to live bad lives. One being heard to say the day before, "Death is better than dishonour." This had come about after reading a series of investigative articles published in the Pall Mall Gazette by Mr. Stead in England. These articles were titled "The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon" and dealt with the topic of child prostitution, abduction, and the procurement of young virgins for sale to pleasure palaces. The articles had a troubling effect on the older Hampton girls and their mother. Earlier in the afternoon, the group had prayed for direction. A clap of thunder was heard, which they took as confirmation that they should die. It was decided that Ethel should be first. Annie and Eleanor held Ethel down as her mother and Mary took razors and cut her throat, continuing until her head was almost severed. The body was then laid on the floor while the women began the next deed. Each of the girls took the razors, cutting into the inner part of the elbow to the bone. Then they lay down to bleed to death. At some time during the night, the bleeding stopped, so the wounds were reopened. Mary began to believe it was for God's will for them to live, as it was Him stopping the bleeding. Around 6 a.m, Elizabeth came out of the room and told her son Charles that he shouldn't be surprised that Ethel was dead, and his sisters had cuts to their arms. On seeing Ethel's body in the corner and his other sisters pale and bleeding, he alerted his father and ran for the doctors, while his father went for the police. Elizabeth was taken into custody and lodged in the Melbourne jail. The girls were confined to another room under the observation of doctors, taking more than a month to recover, and also under police observation. Ethel was laid to rest in the Coburg Cemetery, where her sister Florence was. The funeral was attended by most of the officials from Pentridge. But on returning to the house, Charles Jr. had his own episode of a mental health break. He refused to enter the house where his sister had died. He was taken for a walk and had calmed somewhat, but on returning to the house he became more erratic until he was taken into custody on a charge of lunacy and lodged in the Melbourne jail. At trial, Elizabeth, Annie, Eleanor and Mary were found not guilty by reason of temporary insanity and were all taken to the Melbourne jail. Here they would not be classified as insane or sane, preventing them from either being taken to a lunatic asylum or being released into the community. Annie was admitted to a lunatic asylum in 1887 and remained in institutions until her death in 1943 at Royal Park. Eleanor was thought well enough to leave the jail into the care of a lady who had charge of her, but she too ended up in an asylum, passing away as an inpatient of the Beechworth Asylum in 1905. Charles Jr. spent a few months in the Yarra Bend Lunatic Asylum before returning to Louisa Street. He was still living here with his brother, Frederick, when he died in 1933. Mary died in 1893 at Collingwood, aged just 27 years, and was buried in the family plot at Coburg. Elizabeth died in 1902 in a benevolence asylum in Launceston, Tasmania. It is not known what had happened in the intervening years. Charles Sr. died in 1907 and joined 3 of his daughters in the family plot in the Church of England Cemetery at Coburg Cemetery.